Hey y'all and welcome back. The schedule is finally starting to get a little bit more interesting, so we'll have plenty of names worth watching this coming weekend. To keep things consistent, I'll still be identifying 2 quarterbacks, 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, and 2 tight ends who are eligible for the 2025 draft that I'll be watching this weekend. That being said, there are a lot of really good matchups which make it hard to narrow down the list to just 8 players, so let me know who else you'll be watching this weekend. Now that a lot of team schedules are picking up and players are really starting to solidify themselves as risers, if you want to make sure you don't miss future watch list videos and future content, be sure to subscribe. Now let's get to this list started with some really great matchups. Starting out the list, we have most people's number 1 quarterback for the 2025 draft class who may need to have a good performance to maintain that spot, Carson Beck from Georgia. After a strong and steady season last year, we're starting to see some holes in Beck's armor this season. He seems a bit more rattled and erratic after seeming like the most common collected quarterback last season. The shift was especially noticeable against Kentucky, where Beck struggled all game and the team got lucky to sneak out of that matchup with a win. It'd be one thing if that was a one-off situation this year, but his Clemson game started out a lot worse than his final stat line indicates, and the start to that game was actually very similar to his performance against Kentucky. With Beck not having the rushing out-of-pocket ability as some of the other quarterbacks in this prospective draft class, he'll need to prove he can be a great pocket passer to maintain his current first-round projection. If he struggles against Alabama and continues to struggle this season, I'm concerned it could tank his draft stock that'll have him fall to the second round or maybe even potentially further, or he may just end up having to return for another year of school. Now that Beck and the team are coming off of a bye week, I'll be interested to see how he performs against an Alabama defense and secondary that has shown some holes in this year so far. This will be a great chance for him to rebuild his draft stock in a late-night game traveling to number 4 ranked Alabama, take them on at 7:30 p.m. Eastern this Saturday. I normally try to avoid players in the same game, and especially players at the same position for these watch lists. However, I just couldn't resist how big of a matchup this Alabama-Georgia matchup is this coming weekend. So I'll also be watching Jalen Milroe from Alabama on the other sidelines. Milroe has had an up-and-down start with a good game against Western Kentucky, a very shaky game against USF, which was worse than his stats indicate, and a good rebound game against Wisconsin. Milroe hasn't been asked to do much with easier matchups, but credit to him for typically making good throws when needed, and good gains on the ground when asked to showcase his athleticism. Milroe almost certainly will need to be a bigger contributor this weekend against Georgia's tough defense, and while Milroe has had some fantastic flashes to start this year, him stepping up in a big-time matchup will be more telling for NFL teams if he can handle being their franchise quarterback. So I'll already be catching the game for Carson Beck. I'll also be sure to catch the Alabama and Georgia game to watch Jalen Milroe. I feel it's said too often, so I try to avoid this type of phrasing, but this game should feel like a playoff game and should be worth watching. Moving on to running backs, I'll be watching Devin Neal from Kansas. I feel Neal had a fair amount of hype going into the season, but I started to fade a bit for a combination of reasons. First, it's just a deep running class, so it's hard to keep your name relevant over other backs at more watched programs. Second, it's been miserable watching Kansas' offense due to Jalen Daniels' struggles, so I wouldn't be surprised if a fair amount of people find themselves shifting to other games when Kansas is on TV. Third, I think the most disappointing for me is due to Neal's lack of involvement in the passing game. Last year, Neal had a solid 25 receptions at 31 targets, going for 217 yards and a touchdown, and ran a little over 25% of his snaps on pass attempts out of either the slot or out wide. That type of involvement combined with his good hands and athleticism made it really exciting to see how Kansas continued to unleash him in the pass game. However, Kansas actually barely used Neal in the passing game, with him only getting 2 receptions on 2 targets for 35 yards, and has only used him in the slot and out wide about 5% of his pass attempts this year. It's just kind of baffling of how little they're using him as a playmaker when he's their best playmaker on offense. Now, we have seen a bit of an uptake in Neal after seeing some great efficiency at averaging 6.2 yards per carry while forcing 18 missed tackles on 72 rush attempts this year. He had 23 rush attempts against UNLV a couple weeks ago and 27 against West Virginia last weekend, so hopefully the team continues to shift towards using him more with Daniels clearly struggling, but we'll just have to continue to monitor this season. Speaking of monitoring, I'll be sure to be watching Neal this weekend to see how much they use him in the ground game and see if they get him more involved in the passing game finally. Against a quality TCU opponent, they absolutely will need to rely on him, and hopefully they'll go into this game with that mentality. So check out Devin Neal take on TCU at 3:30 p.m. Eastern this Saturday. Now, if we want to talk about being featured, I'll be watching Kansas State's feature running back DJ Giddens this weekend. Giddens is someone that I wasn't overly impressed with during my summer watch despite the good statistical year he had last year. He put up 1,226 rushing yards on 223 carries and 326 receiving yards on 30 receptions, but he wasn't forcing missed tackles at a high rate and was more of a dump-off guy in the receiving game than a dynamic receiver. For the very start of this season, he looked great with really great contact balance and the continued production on the ground and in the air. The problem was that it was against Tennessee Martin and Tulane. The following week he played against Arizona, whose defense is definitely a step above those teams, but not a powerhouse, and it was kind of the same issues I saw last year with decent but not great contact balance, and he unfortunately wasn't able to get going in the receiving game. Then against BYU, he had a pretty underwhelming performance of just 93 yards on the ground on 19 carries with no targets and a fumble. On top of that, though BYU is the first game Giddens has had a drop this season, he has had 3 drops already on just 11 targets, which is obviously substantially a higher rate than last year for him, but it's also more drops than he's had in all of last year. With Giddens at least looking like a dump-off guy right now, these drops could really hurt his draft stock if they continue throughout the season. So now that Giddens has another tough match against Oklahoma State this weekend, I'll be interested to see if he's more of a dominant player like he was against lesser teams, or if he'll still be underwhelming and not reach his potential at his size and how his hands hold up. So be sure to check out Giddens against number 20 ranked Oklahoma State this weekend at 12 p.m. Eastern. Going to receivers, I'll be watching Elic Ayomanor from Stanford. Ayomanor is someone that I've been a fan of for a while and seems to be consistently getting praise across a lot of people this season to start the year. While he has put up solid numbers, they aren't as gaudy as some other receiver prospects with his target numbers due to Ashton Daniels' struggles as a downfield passer. However, when Daniels is able to connect with Ayomanor, he is usually able to deliver on contested catches and even great catches like his one-handed touchdown against Syracuse this last weekend. I think Ayomanor could start to slide in people's rankings again if Stanford's passing attack gets worse, but Ayomanor shouldn't receive much of any blame for this since he has the ability to play inside, outside, has clean releases, really quality route runner, has great athleticism, and really great hands. Ayomanor passed the eye test last season and continues to pass it this season against quality opponents like Syracuse and TCU. While Stanford's passing attack could definitely be limited due to Daniels, I'll be very interested in watching Ayomanor travel to number 17 ranked Clemson this Saturday at 7 p.m. Eastern to see if he can continue to look like a great do-it-all receiver and someone who could continue to push for day 2, potentially day 1 draft capital. For my other receiver, I'll be watching Pat Bryant from Illinois. I admittedly could have gone with Zachary Franklin, who has also revived his draft prospects at Illinois and has been a big contributor, but with Franklin being an older prospect, I wanted to focus on the younger Pat Bryant. Bryant has had an average career so far at Illinois and about as much as you can expect from an Illinois receiver, which isn't meant to be major shade towards Illinois or their receivers, since as a Badger fan, I really can't speak ill on any passing attack, especially where our program is right now, but they just haven't had the passing success to lead to more productive seasons. However, the addition of Zachary Franklin and both quarterback Luke Altmaier and receiver Pat Bryant taking a step forward has really let the offense flourish to start the season and has allowed Bryant to be on pace to easily break his career highs and look like a great sure-handed outside receiver who should have a role with an NFL team. Bryant's rise also hasn't been against just bad opponents, as he put up 70 yards against both Kansas and Nebraska in the past few weeks. It did take overtime for Bryant to get to 70 yards against Nebraska, but he also came through with 2 touchdowns, including the game-winning score, so I think we can cut him a little slack. So I'll be interested to see if Bryant can continue to step forward against tougher competition, with their hardest matchup of this season so far, when the team travels to number 9 ranked Penn State this Saturday to take them on at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Finishing things out with tight ends, I'll be watching McRee from USC. After being an afterthought and more of a dump-off option for USC and Caleb Williams last year, McRee has already nearly matched his career high for receiving yards this season, despite working his way back from a torn ACL last December and an underwhelming game last week against Michigan. While he still isn't working his way too deep on the field, his ADOT has taken a positive step forward, going from 3.6 last year to 5.5 to start this year. So while he had a poor Michigan game where he struggled to make much of a difference in the receiving game, his new involvement has been a positive change and a really promising one that could continue to get better as he continues to get further from that ACL injury. What has also been nice to see is his blocking has mostly looked good outside of last weekend. If you're watching the video, you can see that he plays the majority of his snaps in line and has played 72.5% of his snaps there to start the season. He almost always has been used this way, and I would expect that to continue with the number of teams using more condensed formations, and it could help make him more appealing. Now, as I mentioned throughout this though, last weekend was really rough, but the team as a whole really struggled against Michigan, so I'm hoping McRee can rebound and be a more useful weapon as a receiver and helpful in the run game. So though people could have argued he should have been on last week's watch list, as a Badgers fan, I'll definitely be watching McRee take on Wisconsin at 12 p.m. Eastern this Saturday. For the other tight end, I'll be watching a potential sleeper tight end who I feel I may be trying hard to push the agenda for, Helms from Western Kentucky. After earning the starting spot in 2023, Helms had a solid but not great 2023 season, putting up 22 catches for 289 yards and a touchdown. Those numbers don't sound amazing for an offense that passes as often as Western Kentucky does, but their offense typically funnels passes to receivers on screens and short passes. In the opportunities Helms did get, he looked explosive and a clear mismatch at his level of competition. This year, the team has been going to him more, realizing that he's a difference maker, and Helms definitely still has some struggles, specifically with his hands, but there's more good than bad for him, and he looks like a dynamic receiving threat with some really good upside if he's used more and creatively. So with not a lot of tough matchups given Western Kentucky's schedule, and Helms not being able to do much against Alabama when they faced them a few weeks ago, I'll be interested in watching him travel to a quality Boston College team, take them on this Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern. And that does it for the players for Week 5. Again, a really great week if you want to see how some of these players perform, and really just a great week for college football. As I mentioned, there are a lot of names that I had to leave off this list that I still think are worth watching, so let me know in the comments or on Twitter or X who you'll be watching this weekend. Again, with the season getting more interesting and things heating up, be sure to subscribe to not miss any future week's videos and keep up to date on players that you should be watching. While you're at it, like the video as it would help the channel and the series grow thanks to you. As usual, you can check out Fantasy Trading Room as a contributor in the NFL, Dynasty, and Fantasy pages there. Also, I again want to bring up a weekly article series I write on Fantasy Trading Room called the College Football Stock Report that identifies 8 players who had strong performances and 8 who hurt their draft stock after each week in college football. I include a link to most recent edition in the description if you want to catch up on players who played last weekend. But thank you all and see you all next time.